So in our research, we wanted to study what could affect our brains and how like high temperature and high heart rate affected our cognitive performance in that respect. So we did kind of like a pilot study with this, and that's why we call it evaluation of cognitive performance in high temperature with heart rate. And it's by Leighton Wood, Hunter Strobel, and Eduardo Leon. And so we'll be getting into that, and we'll dive deeper into this. An overview of our research. So we got a bunch of people, a bunch of volunteers to come in and have us test their cognitive ability as their heart rate was increased from this temperature increase. And so over time we tested this and we got a bunch of participants. We'll go over this a little bit more later in our analysis and our methods of what we did. As you can see, it was uh, as temperature went up, and we tested the heart rate and the cognitive ability of the people in our study. Why we chose this. So just last year in Australia, $6.2 billion was lost due to heat-related stress. And so when the heat was so hot in Australia, the people started working, their cognitive ability went down. And so they lost $6.2 billion in revenue that year. And it really affected their economy. And so we want to find ways that we can find the optimal temperature to help people's cognitive ability be at the max, to be at its best. So that's why we wanted to study a little bit more about this. Economic loss is a big downturn when cognitive ability is lost. And as we can see in China, just last year, the GDP went down in China by 1% just because of the heat related cognitive ability reduction. Also in China, 26,800 people died due to heat-related stress and in their jobs. And so we can see that this is not just a cognitive problem, but it can also lead to death. Your heart rate goes up and you just sweat and you just die because you're so hot. And so we want to go into that, and that's why we chose this.
So for the design of this experiment, we each constructed these 3 by 4 meter climate controlled rooms, and they were composed of 3 tables. 2 tables were for the subjects, and 1 table was for the experimenter. The 2 subjects were placed at the table with computers and monitors, and they were administered specific tests while the experimenter was in there, who gave them surveys to measure. In this room, it was composed of steel and was able to be climate controlled, and we measured the temperature for each experiment that the subjects participated in. To choose the subjects, we went around university campuses in China, and we gave out flyers for people to fill out if they wanted to participate. We posted this online, and we got a lot of feedback. We got a lot of subjects, but we had to filter through to get the ones that were right for the study. We didn't want anybody to have any ailments or diseases, so they were all healthy. They were all not chronically ill. They weren't colorblind, because that could have affect some of the other measurements that we tested. None of them had cardiovascular diseases. They were all non-smokers. They were all postgraduates between the ages of 20 and 30, graduates or postgraduates between the ages of 20 and 30, and they were all healthy. A total of 104 participants were chosen, and each subject participated in 3 separate experiments. Once the subjects were chosen, they were hooked up to a heart rate monitor. It was a chest strap monitor with electrodes that measured their heart rate throughout the experiment. They were then placed in the climate controlled room for one experiment after the waiting period in the waiting room, where they filled out information on how they slept and how they were feeling for that day. After we put them in this room, they were then administered several tests on the computer. And and their heart rate was measured throughout these tests. We gave them many tests. One of the tests were neurological behavioral tests. The first one evaluated the indoor quality on work efficiency. They were also given a visual learning test where they were chosen to match pictures. They were given simple arithmetic, addition and multiplication, and they were also given a Stroop test, which is like this one you see on the screen here, where they were told to read the word and not the color of the word. And they were also given overlapping and redirection tests, which measure visual perception. Um, and then they were given a typing test and a D2 test that examines attention and concentration. Throughout the experiment, the participants were given by the experimenter several different surveys to fill out. These surveys measured their perceived ability and their perceived how they felt while they were participating in the experiment. The first was the self-reported work performance. So depending on temperature and how they felt during that time, they rated themselves on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being very poor and 100 being excellent, which means that they felt like they could perform very well. They also took a survey on the alertness scale, which was measured from -4 to 4, -4 being very sleepy and 4 being extremely alert. They also filled out a thermal sensation survey, which was also measured on a scale of -4 to 4, -4 being very cold and 4 being very hot. This is the summary of the experiment. As we can see, 104 participants, each participated in 3 separate experiments at 3 separate climate temperatures in the control room. They lasted for approximately 175 minutes each, and each subject was tested on and responded to the same surveys in each experiment. They took the exact same tests in each experiment, as well as the same surveys, so we could have the same measurements to compare the data on how they performed in hot, warm, and cool temperatures.
So essentially, the main idea with this experiment was that higher temperatures led to a higher heart rate, which can then potentially lead to psychological indicators that can alter cognitive performance. A simple graph is shown on this slide, which basically represents higher temperatures equals higher heat stress, which leads to less cognitive performance. And the next slide shows just that. If you look along the graph that is represented here, there seems to be a linear trend where the higher the temperature, the more the temperature increases, the higher the heart rate. So we were essentially putting our candidates in these high temperatures to alter their heart rates to see if this was in fact the case. So there was about 1,478 viable samples from these candidates, 104 candidates that we were experimenting on. And so we took the averages from these samples and placed them onto various graphs. But one thing to consider was their self-report. After they completed their test, we basically asked them how they felt when they completed these said tasks, and a lot of them, if you can imagine, were not in exactly the best comfortable situations. So the more the heat rose, the higher the heart rate, the more they felt that they were slipping in their cognitive abilities to perform these tests. Continuing on with the slides, that trend was very apparent to the tests that were performed. The next slide shows just that, especially when it comes to tests such as visual learning ability. However, That test has a very interesting outcome. These tests here that are in front of us, though, suggest that there tends to be a sweet spot where heart rate and accuracy tends to balance out each other. That range normally tends to be around the 80 to 90. So that sweet spot led to not an increased performance, but a relatively stable performance in cognitive ability. In some cases, such as the addition test and typing test, the uh, the trend tends to basically be a negative slope, which suggests that no matter the conditions, the increased heart rate tends to alter their performances in these specific areas of cognitive function. Uh, Another variable to consider, especially when experimenting with a general group of people, is gender. One would think that gender plays an interesting and significant role into this experiment. However, our data shows that variability in gender tends to be very insignificant. These were the only three tests where gender showed some slight deviation. Uh, Females tend to naturally have a higher resting heart rate than males. The average value of males and females completing cognitive performance were very close. However, this is not a competition about gender and how males and females perform under stress, especially in high temperatures. This simply suggests that the variability of gender is something that can be pushed to the side for this instance, especially since they were extremely close. However, for visual learning, it seemed that females tend to outperform males. This was the only real significant deviation that we can find in the data that we were pulling from these 104 candidates. Continuing on to a data summary, basically the bigger picture is the higher the heart rate, the 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 more we tend to lose focus at the thing that we are doing in front of us. Self-report tends to go down at 80 beats per minute, while working memory and rate of learning decrease at about 110. So it's interesting that we see that trend, while at the same time noticing that there's also a sweet spot for learning.
So why should you care? Like Eduardo said, we want to find that sweet spot for learning, that sweet spot for uh, teaching, and for being the better employee. So as we look at this graph to the left, heart rate can indicate the intensity of the heat strain. So as the cognitive performance is the highest, we can see that there's an optimal range there for temperature. And as we go through a higher heart rate, that leads to worse cognitive performance. So it leads to worse workers and leads to, like in Australia, a loss of money. So if you want your business to do better and like your employees to report better, your students, or even to be a better professor, you want to find that optimal temperature that the studies can show you of where you want to perform the highest ability that you know you can succeed in. As we can see in this pictogram, heat stress leads to a higher heart rate, which leads to lower cognitive performance. And that's just what it teaches us in this study.